All right, thank you. I want to begin by giving all praise and thanks to the only true triune God, the God who loved his people, gave his son on their behalf, and poured out his spirit so that they might believe in him, love him, worship him, and serve him. It's that God that my hope for Shadid and others, it's my hope that they'll come to know him. And for that reason, I engage in debates of this sort. Now, I have to begin by addressing an elephant in the room. Shadid has appealed to John chapter 1 in order to prove that Muhammad was the prophet spoken of there and predicted as yet to come. And yet, one couldn't choose a text that's more explicit and clear with respect to the divine identity of Jesus, something that Muhammad, as a self-proclaimed prophet, vociferously opposed. In fact, Shadid even read in the text where John, when he said who he is, in contrast to who he is not, he read the words of John when John said, "I am a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord," as Isaiah the prophet said. So John came to prepare the way for Jesus as the Lord. The idea that then Muhammad would be the prophet mentioned here and the prophet would explicitly contradict that is not only passing strange, but just patently absurd. There's another elephant in the room here. According to this text, it's the religious leaders who are opposed to both John and Jesus who make the distinction between Elijah, the prophet, and the Christ. When John responds in the negative, he's simply denying or negating that he is who they are asking him about. He's not affirming their false understanding of those things. In fact, the very fact that John could say he's not Elijah shows that it's their particular understanding that the historical figure was to come rather than that historical figure was a type of one who would come in the spirit and power of Elijah, as Jesus said. That's what John is negating. So John is not affirming here the religious leaders' understanding of Elijah or of the prophet or of the Christ. He's simply saying, I'm none of the figures that you're thinking of and that you're expecting. Who I am is one who is crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. So remember yesterday when I debated Shadid, when it came to the suffering servant of Isaiah, he said in order for that text to be about Jesus, he had to fulfill everything. I quite agree with that. Now, by the same token, Shadid, if he's going to be honest and consistent with his own standards, has to say that this text must be completely accepted in order to say that it actually speaks about Muhammad. But in any case, let's suppose that I grant everything to Shadid, that the prophet is someone other than the Christ. That wouldn't prove that it is Muhammad. That wouldn't prove, and neither would any of the other things that he said based on Deuteronomy 18. Deuteronomy 18, the vague way in which he described what Deuteronomy 18 is talking about could be true of any prophet. I don't think he accurately handled Deuteronomy 18. I'm going to look at that in a moment. But any prophet could have fulfilled those words. There's nothing that points us to Muhammad in any of that. He said that God would put his words in the prophet's mouth. The same thing was true of Jeremiah. The same thing was true of Isaiah. The same thing was true of Ezekiel. How does that point us to Muhammad? He said that Muhammad also spoke to the Israelites. All the prophets spoke to the Israelites. How does this prove that Muhammad is a prophet or the prophet? In fact, I could just as well say that the prophet is a reference to Paul. I don't hold that. I'm just saying Paul spoke to the Israelites. Paul spoke the words of God according to the New Testament. Therefore, he could be that prophet. There's nothing specific, nothing unambiguous in the way Shadid has handled these things that point us to Muhammad. There's no reason to believe that he's a prophet at all. And there's good reason to think he's not a prophet, certainly not a prophet in the stream of prophets in the Israelite tradition. Those prophets all affirmed the deity of the coming Messiah, as we saw in John 1, something Muhammad denied. All the prophets taught the Messiah's deity. Muhammad didn't. So he's disqualified based on these sorts of criteria. But what does Deuteronomy 18 actually say? I quite agree with Shadid that this is the background to the discussion in John chapter 1. Here's what Deuteronomy 18 says. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you. It doesn't just say that he would speak to them. It says that he would come from among them. And then it adds further, from your brothers. From your very kin, you shall listen to him. This indicates that the prophet that would come, like Moses, must be an Israelite. By the way, notice that the religious leaders upon whom Shadid is devolving his confidence, that he's accepting their distinction between the prophet Elijah and the Christ, they assume that the prophet would be an Israelite. So if we're going to go on the basis of their assumptions, then the prophet was an Israelite. That's what the text actually says in Deuteronomy 18. But notice, these religious leaders in John 1 went to John the Baptist, a Jew. These were Jews going to a Jew in Israel, the land of the Jews. They weren't going to Arabia looking for an Arab to see if he was the prophet. They recognized that the prophecy says, the Lord your God will raise up for you. Moses is talking to the Israelites, a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren. You shall listen to him. Shadid also said that, and rightly, that this prophet would speak God's words, but he didn't accurately deal with the nature or the mode of that revelation, how it would be received by this prophet. Moses soared above other prophets in the Old Testament in a particular way in the mode in which he received revelation. For example, it says in Deuteronomy 18, verse 16, it says, this is according to all that you asked of the Lord your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God. Let me not see this great fire anymore, or I will die. What this is referring to is back at Sinai, God descended upon the mountain. It was all ablaze. The earth quaked. There were thunderings, and God spoke in the hearing of the Israelites. They didn't see him, but they heard him. He spoke the words of the 10 commandments, and the Israelites were frightened, and they said, you speak to God, Moses, and then you come and tell us what he said. In other words, they wanted Moses to speak directly to God for them, and then in turn reveal his word to them. This is the distinctive thing about Moses as a prophet. In fact, in Numbers chapter 12, when Miriam and Aaron, the sister and brother of Moses, tried to assert their equality with Moses, the Lord was angry with them. They thought they were equal to Moses because they too were prophets. They spoke words inspired by God. But God was angry with them for thinking that they were equal to Moses. And in Numbers 12, we're told that God came down and he rebuked Miriam and Aaron, saying, when a prophet appears among you, I reveal myself to him through dreams and visions, but not so, and listen to this carefully, not so with my servant Moses. With him I speak face to face, openly, and he beholds the form of the Lord. So when Moses speaks of a prophet who would be like him, number one, he would have to be an Israelite, not just somebody who spoke to Israelites, but from among them, from their brethren. He also would have to be somebody who spoke face to face with God. He had a direct connection with God. He wasn't, in other words, receiving revelation through the medium of an angel, which is the claim of Muhammad. It's a false claim. Muhammad was not talking to the angel Gabriel. But even if we take the claim at face value, that disqualifies Muhammad as the prophet like Moses. Moses spoke with God directly, and this is what set him apart from other prophets. The prophet who was to come must have this immediate knowledge, face-to-face knowledge of God. He must be somebody who was with God in some sense and dwelt in his presence and knew him intimately, immediately.